Hello and welcome to Chapter 13 of Modern World History. And this chapter is titled Limits to Growth. And in it, I want to kind of look at the history of the question, are human societies able to continue growing forever, or are there some limits on the Earth's carrying capacity? And this is a question that people have been wondering about and thinking about and even worrying about for some time now. And although we could probably go back further, let's begin with one of the original statements of this, which was made by Thomas Robert Malthus. And Malthus was concerned about population. And population is kind of one of the most basic but often overlooked aspects of human interactions with the environment that we tend to study in fields like environmental history. There are a number of reasons why people have tended to try to avoid thinking about the danger of having too many humans around. First of all, we like people, and we especially like those that are close to us, our family, our friends. And historically, the growth of our own particular group has been important for our own survival, and therefore growing our group has been desirable. In the past, people haven't always been that concerned about whether the success of their particular group came at the expense of neighbors or people far away. And recently, of course, the neighborhood has expanded to cover the whole globe. There's an economic concept called the zero-sum game that says that for every winner, there has to be a loser. And this isn't always true in all economic endeavors, but it is in many. But since the Industrial Revolution, especially, Westerners have really pretty much been able to live outside of the constrictions of zero-sum logic. But that doesn't mean that all Westerners have been unaware of the question. At the very beginning of the modern age, this English economist named Thomas Robert Malthus, who lived from 1766 to 1834, published a short booklet called An Essay on the Principle of Population. Malthus's theory, which he published in 1798, became instantly controversial on both sides of the Atlantic. Thomas Jefferson sent a copy of the book to his favorite economist, Jean-Baptiste Say, the French economist who economic students will know from Say's law, and Jefferson asked Say for his opinion on the issue. Malthus had stated his basic idea like this. He said, "The increase in population is necessarily limited by the means of subsistence. The population does invariably increase when the means of subsistence increase. And then the superior power of population is repressed and the actual population is kept equal to the means of subsistence only by misery and vice." Another way of saying this is, population grows as fast as there is food and water to support it. And when these resources run out, population is brought back down through famine, disease, and war. These three causes of population are nowadays often called Malthusian disasters. Malthus went on to observe that populations tend to increase geometrically. That's the curved line on the graph. 2 people become 4, 4 become 8, 8 become 16, etc. In contrast, he said, food supplies, at best, only increase arithmetically. 2 bushels of wheat might become 4, which might then become 6, which might then become 8. By this logic, it's pretty easy to see that a society can easily outrun its ability to feed itself if the population is not kept down by reducing births or by increasing deaths. And it's easy to understand why early modern Europeans were so obsessed with acquiring new territories to improve their abilities to produce food. The famines, diseases, and wars of European history gave Malthus all the examples he needed of the crises that he said tended to reduce populations. If society was going to avoid these disasters, Malthus argued, then it would need to find some way of limiting the birth rate to avoid starving. The Malthusian theory, as it is called, was intensely controversial right from the start. One of the reasons was that it advocated birth control. Malthus himself only called for what he termed moral restraint to help reduce the birth rate. But many Malthusians had much more active contraceptive measures in mind. The idea of limiting reproduction was seen by most religious people as a violation of their God's injunction to be fruitful and multiply. And also, they thought, eliminating the risk of pregnancy was an encouragement to vice and an invitation to sin. Over 2 centuries later, you might notice we're still having a lot of these same arguments. The other big controversy surrounding Malthusian thought was that it was used by some members of the upper classes, especially in Great Britain, to argue that the conditions of the poor should not be improved. If poor people had higher wages and more to eat, they argued, then they would certainly have more children, and more of their children would survive, which would put unnecessary stress on the social system and, in the long run, lead to mass starvation. The poor simply had to suffer, they said, or all of society would be doomed. But the assumption held by Malthus and those members of the British upper classes, and by many people today, that feeding the poor would lead to a population explosion turns out actually to be unfounded and untrue. Population scientists, like this guy Hans Rosling, who you see on the screen, and whose video you can watch in the ebook, they now agree, after studying societies all over the world, that as economic security increases, a demographic shift occurs and birth rates decline. Another way to accelerate this demographic shift, they found, is to educate women in these societies. In other words, if the poor have enough to eat and if women are educated, then infant mortality rates will decline and the fear of starving in old age will decrease. Death rates decline, and as a result, parents naturally will have fewer children. Both of these factors, the increased feeling of security among the people and the education of women, reduce birth rates and have contributed to demographic shifts in the developed world, where family sizes have decreased from an average of 6 children per family to 1.6 in the modern era. But in spite of the developed world's success limiting population growth by providing education for women and providing a social safety net, the argument still rages regarding the developing world. About a decade ago, the Gates Foundation started a campaign called #StopTheMyth. And according to a short video titled "You Decide, Save the People or Save the Planet," Melinda Gates suggested that the issue is still poorly understood. And she pointed out that in Afghanistan, where 10% of the children die before the age of 5, population is expected to nearly double by 2050. In Thailand, on the other hand, which at the time that she did the video had about the same population, the number of children dying had decreased substantially, and so had the birth rate. So clearly, Melinda Gates said, letting children die now so that they don't strain the planet later doesn't really work. It's a myth. The other assumption that you may have noticed in that Malthusian theory was that food production could only increase slowly. As we've already seen, this has not been the experience of the modern era, and especially of the 19th and the 20th centuries. Abundant land, fertilizers, and technology helped a global green revolution that has allowed us to continually outrun Malthus for the last 2 centuries. But an agricultural scientist named Carl Sprengel noticed as far back as 1828 that plant growth was limited by the availability of the essential nutrient with the lowest concentration. Sprengel's contemporary, the biologist Justus von Liebig, realized that this idea had wider applications and popularized it as Liebig's law. This law, which has become a key idea in ecology, says that growth generally is dictated not by the total resources that are available, but by the scarcest resource, which he called the limiting factor. So the question is, will we be able to keep outrunning Malthus forever, or will a limiting factor, or maybe even more than one, end our exponential growth? Until very recently in human history, the Earth has been so big, and the total human population so small, relatively, that the resources available to us have often seemed infinite. As recently as 1800, there were fewer than 1 billion people on the planet. In 1900, there were still less than 2 billion. By 1960, there were 3 billion, and in 1999, there were 6 billion. Current world population is estimated to be slightly over 8 billion. And during this dramatic increase, there were periods like the early Industrial Revolution when warriors like Malthus and his followers did express doubts and anxiety. Malthus had no idea that his nation was about to expand its empire once again into Africa and into Asia, or that continuing emigration to the Americas and Australia would continue to reduce populations at home. And of course, he couldn't anticipate advances in technology or the demographic effects of increasing economic security that we've just discussed. But sometimes even these advances proved temporary or subject to disruption. The population in Ireland boomed in the first decades of the 19th century as potatoes, which you'll remember had been discovered in South America, increased the calories available to poor people and seemed to eliminate the threat of famine once and for all. The Irish population peaked at over 8 million in 1841. But the blight that eliminated their main food source killed over 1 million people and forced 1 million more to emigrate to America. The Irish population is still only about 4.8 million today, a little more than half its peak 175 years ago. And finally, as the science of ecology developed in the second half of the 20th century, and we began to distinguish between renewable and non-renewable resources, the Malthusian anxiety returned. In 1968, a Stanford University biology professor named Paul R. Ehrlich published a sensational book called The Population Bomb that was an instant bestseller. It began with this statement: "The battle to feed all of humanity is over." But he wasn't saying it was over in a good way. He continued by saying, in the 1970s, hundreds of millions of people will starve to death, in spite of any crash programs embarked upon now. At this late date, nothing can prevent a substantial increase in the world death rate. Sounds pretty alarming. Ehrlich became a celebrity and publicized these theories of social collapse in popular media, like Johnny Carson's Tonight Show. Ehrlich's scenarios inspired some really great dystopian science fiction. Movies like Mad Max and Logan's Run and Soylent Green. But luckily, these predictions didn't happen in the way that Ehrlich had said they would. Actually, a couple of 100 million people did really die of hunger in the decades after the book was published. It's hard to tell exactly because when the United Nations reported worldwide deaths in the 1970s, it specifically omitted deaths from hunger. But, as it turned out, these deaths did not reduce world population overall or result in the social chaos that Ehrlich had prophesied. So by sounding that alarm and having nothing happen, the population bomb may have done more harm than good in the long run. But some people did remain concerned about the rapid, nearly exponential increase in the world's human population. In 1972, an international organization called the Club of Rome published a study that it titled The Limits to Growth. Unlike Ehrlich's sensational predictions of doom, The Limits to Growth applied mathematical systems modeling to 5 particular variables that they had identified: world population, industrialization, pollution, food production, and natural resource depletion. And these researchers used newly available computer technology to produce a study that illustrated the interactions of all of these variables by showing potential future outcomes. And they chose to publish 3 of these possible futures. In 2 of these scenarios, the global system experiences what the researchers called overshoot and collapse, which would happen based on their calculations in either the mid or the late 21st century. In the 3rd scenario, the computer models did manage to arrive at what the researchers called a stabilized world system. The image that you're looking at here is a 30-year review published in 2008, where the original Club of Rome authors looked at their predictions and compared them to actual observations. And that is kind of the shaded band that you're seeing there between 1970 and 2000. And as you can see, these measures kind of tracked what they had predicted. Now, of course, this doesn't necessarily mean that the rest of the predictions of overshoot and collapse by 2050 are accurate. This is still speculative. But a lot of people who saw this argued that, well, they were close enough to their forecasts for the first 30 years that maybe we should at least take another look at their predictions for the future. These people, of course, were environmentalists. But not all of the warnings that humanity might be reaching resource limits came from university academics or international think tanks that would be naturally interested in coming to that conclusion and would also be naturally distrusted by regular people and especially by corporate leaders. Marion King Hubbard, the guy at the chalkboard there, was an American geophysicist working for Shell Oil in 1956 when he presented a research paper to the oil industry trade group, the American Petroleum Institute, where he showed that for any geographical area, and by implication for the planet as a whole, petroleum production follows a predictable bell-shaped curve. Hubbard's theory correctly predicted that oil production in the continental US would peak between 1965 and 1970, and then begin to decline. Hubbard also predicted that world oil production would peak in what he at the time said would be in about 50 years. Although the data, and especially its interpretations, are still very controversial, several credible sources have suggested that American oil production did peak when he said it would, and that in fact world oil production peaked between 2003 and 2004, right on Hubbard's schedule. Petrochemical prices can be expected to rise if supplies diminish. Currently, similar to the agriculture business, new technologies such as fracking and converting tar sands have added some new sources to the supply of what we now think of as petroleum. These new additions, though, don't necessarily refute the logic of Hubbard's predictions, although they do potentially push back the anticipated supply crunch that we can expect to raise prices someday. And remember that 2 elements of the limits to growth's computer model, industrial production and food supply, depend heavily on the price of energy. And a third, pollution, is also tied to it, and is especially an issue for both the fracking and the tar sands industries. A reduction of the supply of oil, or an increase in its cost, or an increase in pollution could all have significant negative impacts on those variables. And interestingly, Hubbert's words kind of echoed Malthus's. Our principal constraints, Hubbert said, are cultural. During the last 2 centuries, we have known nothing but exponential growth. And in parallel, we have evolved what amounts to an exponential growth culture. A culture so dependent, he said, on the continuation of exponential growth for its stability that it is incapable of reckoning with problems of non-growth. Now, these are not just the words of some dewy-eyed environmentalist or some crazy academic or sensationalist. Hubbert was an oil industry analyst. Some people have continued to argue that possible future discoveries of more oil could postpone society's shift to a non-fossil fuel energy economy. But even the oil industry, for the most part, agrees that production is going to decline. So the question that we're left with is, how quickly will we use up what remains? Some climate activists have begun to suggest that for the sake of the environment, we ought to switch from fossil fuels to other energy sources as soon as possible. And we might want to leave a lot of what's left in the ground. The argument against burning the rest of the oil and the coal and the natural gas is, of course, that fossil fuels are one of the biggest contributors to atmospheric carbon that leads to global warming. And while this is true, other factors, such as deforestation and even agribusiness, also release comparable amounts of carbon. Simply stopping using oil will not necessarily solve the whole climate change problem, although it probably is an important element of the changes that society needs to make to stabilize the global climate. But because energy is such a large part of the economies of especially developed nations, any change is heavily contested. Global energy corporations have a really incredible ability to influence politics. A few years ago, BP, that is British Petroleum, which you'll recall was established in 1908 as the Anglo-Persian Oil Company and is now operating in over 70 countries worldwide, they issued an energy outlook report for the year 2035, which claimed that Hubbert's peak oil scenario was actually incorrect and announced that the company intended to burn just as much as possible over the next 2 decades. BP's claim that oil production hasn't peaked, however, depends on that redefinition of the word oil that includes both tar sands and biofuels such as ethanol. Ethanol production, as we discussed previously, depends not only on the energy-intensive production of surplus corn and cane sugar, which is what they use as the primary plant source in Brazil, but in government subsidies that keep the price of these commodities generally below their cost of production. So it's hard to see how biofuels could legitimately be called a new source of oil. And this brings us kind of inevitably to climate change, which more than any other environmental concern right now has dominated the attention of Americans and Europeans and others in recent years, and has in a lot of cases pushed pollution off the table, which is unfortunate. Although the idea that the planet's climate has been adversely affected by human activity is very controversial in the media and in politics and in popular culture, it is almost universally accepted by scientists. According to NASA, at least 97% of climate scientists have agreed for over a decade that global warming over the past couple of centuries is due to human activities, or what they would call anthropogenic. American and international science organizations like the American Geophysical Union, the American Meteorological Society, and even the American Medical Association, in addition to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, out of the UN, have all gone a step further, saying, in the words of the American Physical Society, we must reduce emissions of greenhouse gases, beginning now. Of course, who they mean by we is unclear, as are the penalties that we might face if we ignore their warnings. These are really hard to specify. We often hear statements like this one. The forecasts show that it is China, India, and other emerging economies that are increasing their carbon emissions at a speed that will cause dangerous climate change. In fact, China already emits more CO2 than the USA, and India already emits more than Germany. This was said by the European Union's environmental minister at the World Economic Forum in Davos in 2007. But what's wrong with this statement? Well, I would suggest a couple of things. First, who have the big greenhouse gas emitters been in the last 100 years? Great Britain, Western Europe, the US. Do they have no responsibility for having brought us to this level? Are we only looking forward from here and blaming China and India? Really? And then secondly, the population of China is about 1.4 billion. India has even more people now, while the US has only about 330 million and Germany has only about 85 million. That means that per capita, China produces about 7.5 tons per year per person. The US produces almost 16 tons, Germany produces 10 tons, and India produces less than 2 tons per person of carbon. So tell me again, who is chiefly responsible? The science is complicated, and it is difficult for some people to understand. And to make matters worse, many Americans share a belief system that distrusts science and scientists. Initially because science seemed to contradict their most cherished religious doctrines about the nature of the world and their place in it, and more recently because science has dramatically and publicly failed and has been manipulated for political gains and for profits by the very people who called themselves the science. And that's created a lot of distrust. To make matters worse, the concern over climate has generally been identified with a particular political orientation. Now, the claim that only liberals care about the environment is not only absurd, but it ignores the traditional meaning of the word conservative. In reality, this is not a liberal versus a conservative issue. But there may be some truth to the claim that most scientists do belong to a particular political tribe. And that was one of the things that we found out to our detriment during COVID. So now, maybe it does make sense to critically evaluate whether the 97% consensus may have been pushed in that direction by the types of political pressure that led to the errors made by the guardians of the science regarding the pandemic. On the other hand, it can also be shown that the argument against climate change has been carefully managed and funded by political action committees and foundations representing the very corporations that oppose changes to energy policy. And before we move on to the next slide, what you're looking at here is the beginning of the YouTube clip of the trailer for Al Gore's documentary called An Inconvenient Truth, which I would invite you to go to the ebook and watch, because it does provide an example of that question of whether or not these issues have been overly politicized to the detriment of the actual message. And this propaganda campaign against climate change has really achieved many of its goals. Although 97% of climate scientists do agree on anthropogenic climate change, when Americans are asked, do most scientists believe that the Earth is getting warmer because of human activity? More than half say either no or that they're not sure. Less than half of Americans are aware that scientists have basically been unanimous on this issue for more than a decade. And thinking that scientists are unsure affects regular people's own opinions about climate change and about the government policies that they might be willing to support to mitigate it. A recent study found that most of the public statements made against climate change in the last 20 years could be tracked to about 90 organizations, which received over $500 million in grants during that period. From 2003 to 2007, this money was easily traced to sources such as Koch Industries and ExxonMobil, two corporations that are clearly opposed to changes in energy policy. And before we move on to the next slide, again, this is an image from a video about that 97% consensus that I've embedded in the ebook. So you should go and take a look at that. So as I said, up until 2007, it was easy to track where this money was coming from and where it was going. But with the changes in foundation funding that followed in the wake of the 2008 Citizens United Supreme Court decision, which allowed corporations to hide their political spending, the sources of the money funding climate change denial have been more difficult to trace. Ultra-free market foundations, and even a few religious organizations like the John Templeton Foundation, fund websites and podcasts that go out of their way to label any scientist who endorses climate change a warmist, somebody who's probably working for Al Gore in an effort to regulate every aspect of our lives and to bring on some big global prison state. Climate deniers warn of what they call command economies that they claim environmentalists want to impose, using language that's deliberately designed to rile up the libertarians and the free market enthusiasts and to mobilize them against changing the economy in ways that, although they would definitely be bad for oil companies, would actually almost certainly create millions of new jobs. But unfortunately, for their part, even the scientists who continue to warn of tipping points and of possible runaway global catastrophes seem to have no solutions to offer except the exact type of world government policies that people trying to protect their individual or their national sovereignty are the most worried about. A recent study found, and I'm going to give you a kind of long quote here so that you can hear the language that it uses. The findings were, the conservative movement, and especially its think tanks, play a critical role in denying the reality and significance of anthropogenic global warming, AGW, especially by manufacturing uncertainty over climate science. Books denying AGW are a crucial means of attacking climate science and scientists, and we examine the links between conservative think tanks, CTTs, and 108 climate change denial books published through 2010. We find a strong link, albeit noticeably weaker for the growing number of self-published denial books. We also examine the national origins of the books and the academic backgrounds of their authors and editors, finding that with the help of American CTTs, climate change denial has spread to several other nations, and that an increasing portion of denial books are produced by individuals with no scientific training. It appears that at least 90% of denial books do not undergo peer review, allowing authors or editors to recycle scientifically unfounded claims that are then amplified by the conservative movement, media, and political elites. And this type of activity, of course, would be problematic, as academics like to say. Is it also problematic, though, that they communicate their findings in this sort of language? Are they actually only interested in talking to their own constituents and scoring rhetorical points? Or would it be more to their benefit to engage with people who might disagree with them and try to find some solution together? If that's the case, this might not be the best way to go about it. And this is unfortunate, to say the least. While Germany has become one of the world leaders in solar energy development, in spite of receiving only about as much sunlight every day as Alaska, and while Britain is trying to shift to a post-oil-based economy with its transition towns, many Americans continue wasting their time arguing over this make-believe issue of climate change denial. Of nearly 14,000 climate articles published in peer-reviewed journals, and peer review, despite being unpopular, is still somewhat of a measure of validity. So of 14,000 of these articles published over a 20-year period, only 24 rejected global warming. So there really isn't that much doubt that the Earth's climate is changing in ways that are going to cause challenges, if not serious social disruption in the future. When Political leaders say there's still doubt about the need to address climate change, which they are saying all the time in this administration. It might be to our benefit to follow the money and try to discover why. Our inability to understand the situation might be causing us to continue to be manipulated by organizations that are interested in maintaining the status quo. And that, unfortunately, might mean that our choices in the future might be much more limited than they need to be. It's a complicated issue, this question of whether we can grow infinitely or whether there might be some limiting factors that we have to think about. But I think it's unfortunately becoming an issue that we have to look at. So I hope you found that a little bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.